Hey folks, Jack from Moonshift Audio here. Today I'm going to be showing you a bit about how to make a huge 80s drum sound that I've heard in quite a few tracks recently. I'm also going to be talking a bit about how a lot of that sound comes from a specific vintage reverb unit. Here's an example of what I mean. To start with, we'll talk a bit about the production element and I'll show you how I chose the sounds and a little bit about how I programmed it. Okay, so here we are in Cubase and I've got an instance of Battery Open, which is a drum sampler that I often use. And I'll just give you a quick rundown of the samples that I chose to make this kit. They're from 80s Drum Machines by Roland, mostly from the 707. This is the 707 kick. I've layered it up with an 808. The 707, which I've mentioned in another video, is quite aggressive. It's got a very clicky, tight top end, but it perhaps doesn't have the same weight as the more famous 808 or even the 909 drum machine. So I've layered an 808 kick. You can see here I've taken the high out of the 808. So on its own, the 808 sounds like this. And without the 808, the 707 sounds like this. Both together. Just a little bit of extra weight there from the 808. I've also chosen a 707 snare and layered it up with a 909 clap. If we just have the snare and the clap there on its own, both together. The clap there just adding a little bit of extra weight. I've got some 707 hi-hats. One slightly more open, and I'm using those just for a bit of variety. And I got some toms and some extra claps, which I'm layering in for some extra weight in the choruses and a few crashes. Okay, effects wise, I haven't done anything too crazy to process these drums, but we'll have a quick look. I've done some basic compression and EQ and saturation. So here's the kick again. And on there I've got this 1176 compressing a fair amount, but with a pretty quick attack and a quick release, just to kind of glue it down a bit, without and with. The Pro Q is just adding some extra punch at the 100 Hz, which is where the sort of kick rather than the sub is of that drum, and some 5K, nice wide boost there to add some clicky top end without that. Just helps to add a little bit more presence. Good old decapitator here, adding a little bit of subtle saturation. Here's without. Just it's adding a bit of presence. It sounds, dry, soloed like this. It sounds a little bit distorted, but you won't hear that in the mix. And then sometimes the decap saturator can do funny things to the bottom end. You can lose a bit of weight down there. So here I'm just rolling off the very bottom end that we don't really need and adding in some sub just for a bit of extra weight. Moving on to the snare then. No compression on the snare, but there's quite a lot of EQ here. I'm scooping out the bottom end that we have no real use for in the snare, adding a bit of body at 200 Hz and just a little bit of presence at 3K. Here's without the EQ. And with. Again, a decapitator just to give this a bit more presence. Here's without. And with. And another bit of extra presence and a tilt EQ. I found that once I got this in the mix, I wanted it to be even brighter. Without. With, you can hear it just gives it a little bit of extra presence up there. I've also got a filter here, but that's for something that I did later in the arrangement. It doesn't really play into how I actually mixed these drums, so I'm going to ignore that for now. Pattern wise, it's a very simple pattern that I've drawn for these drums. There's no hi-hats in at this stage, so let's just have a quick listen to this. Obviously at this stage, even though the processing is there, these drums do not have that life and impact that we heard earlier. So the real thing that we need to look at is the reverb. And if I just unmute the 3 verbs that I've got going on here for the drums, you should hear the difference immediately. And there it is. Okay, so what is it about this reverb? The Advanced Music Systems RMX16 was first released in 1982 and quickly became one of the all-time classic digital reverb units. This reverb defined the sound of an era. It was used in one of the most famous drum intros of all time, of In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins. If you haven't heard that, you should definitely check it out. But it's also been used on countless modern hits by artists like Radiohead, Rihanna. The list is quite extensive. If you want to buy one of these reverb units today, one of the original ones would set you back about $3,000 US, but they're actually still manufacturing a 500 series version, so you could buy one new. Luckily, there are also plug-in versions available by Universal Audio, which is the one that I've been using, and Waves do one as well. The sound of this reverb unit comes from its unique digital reverb algorithms. It's got the usual ones that you might expect to find on most digital reverb units, like a room, hall, and a plate, but unusually the RMX16 also has an ambience algorithm and a non-linear algorithm, which for the time was pretty groundbreaking. I'm using the non-linear algorithm on my kick and snare. Let's take a look. Okay, so back in Cubase, let's take a look at the send effects that I've got going on for the kick, the snare, and the drums as a whole. We'll start with the kick, and as you can see, the first insert on that send channel is the RMX16 Reverb. Here it is. This is what it looks like. The interface, I've got to say, I don't really like it very much. It is absolutely faithful to the original, like most of the UAD plugins are, but it's not very user-friendly. You know, like if I want to change a value, I have to click here and then type here the number, or I can type it in on the keyboard, but wouldn't it be nice just to be able to click and drag that up and down, or, you know, use any other kind of modern interface? It would just be so much easier, but it is what it is, and it does sound good. So you can see here I've got my 80s kick preset that I made using the Nonlinear 2 program, and it sounds like this. Really quite gritty, not a particularly nice sound, but it really, really works in this context. Following that, there's some EQ on the reverb, so I'm taking out a whole load of mud here, putting the mid-range, that sort of 500 hertz meat back in, and then scooping out some of the presence because it's just too much. So if I play this, just helps to, in the context of the mix, stop that reverb from getting too out of control. I've also got a free Brainworks solo plugin here, which is literally removing all of the stereo information from that. I want the kick drum to sit right down the middle, and having stereo reverb can really kind of take away from the focus of that. This is a free plugin, but you can also, most DAWs have a stereo widener or mono maker plugin in their roster, so you can just pull in one of those and you'll be fine. Looking at the snare, you can see here I've got another instance of the RMX16. There's a snare preset that I made, again using the Nonlinear 2 algorithm. It's very, very similar. It's got a slightly longer decay. Most of the drums are also going to a drum reverb bus, so I'll just mute that so you can hear what the snare is like just with that one reverb. Again, it's almost like a gated effect. Really meaty, quite metallic, and just, yeah, pretty gritty sounding. I've just put a bit of meat, a bit of weight down here with the EQ of the reverb itself, and I've taken away some of the presence because it's just getting a bit out of hand there in the mix. The third reverb here is a more general reverb. It's another RMX16 to keep that 80s flavour, but I've used the 1980s drum hall preset, which is just one of the stock ones that comes with the UAD version. But it's a hall reverb, so it's a lot more similar to something that you might find in another plugin. And if I just take away the other two reverbs for the kick and the snare, you'll hear what I mean. So that's adding the real sort of space to the drums. These short, non-linear verbs really become part of the character of the sound itself. They almost sound like an extension of the kick and the snare. So there you have it. That's really kind of it. You know, basic, quite simple drums. Sure, you got to choose appropriate samples to get an authentic 80s sound, but really what's given the drums their character is that RMX16 reverb. Now I know how annoying it is when you see someone making a video of a really cool sound that you'd like to use yourself, but you don't have access to the same hardware or plugins that they're using. Not everyone's using UAD, and the RMX16 isn't yet available in their native package, so I've had a bit of a play around with Valhalla Vintage Verb, which is one of my all-time favourite modern reverbs, to see if I could create a similar sound. The Valhalla reverbs are honestly, I think, some of the best around today, and they're so reasonably priced. They never go on sale, but they're always priced at $50 for each one, and given the excellent support that Valhalla DSP offer and the constant updates that they're making to even their free reverbs, I think they're a really, really good purchase. Also, the Valhalla Vintage Verb happens to have a non-linear algorithm, which is perfect for trying to recreate these kind of sounds. It's not exactly the same sound because the RMX16 also colours the audio that goes into it with the vintage converters and some of the other stages in the processing, but I've managed to get pretty close, and I think the patches that I've managed to create for the Valhalla give the same kind of energy, and at the end of the day, that's what you really want when you're making music. See what you think. Okay, so here we are back in Cubase. You can see here that I've muted the returns for those 3 RMX16 reverb sends that I was using, and we should have very, very dry sounding drums now. Yep, sounding pretty flat and lifeless there. So you can see here that I have pulled together 3 reverbs. I've done a kick there in purple, a snare, and this is the one that I made for the drum hall. And I've done my best to recreate that flavour of the RMX16. It's not perfect, but see what you think. I'll unmute these and you can have a listen. So there you go, that's my 80s reverb presets. There's a link below where you can download those Valhalla presets for free. If you found this video useful, consider liking and subscribing for more tips, tricks, tutorials and free resources. Until next time.